Chapter 1. "I'm dying of curiosity," Jessica Wakefield cried to her identical twin Elizabeth as they entered their house after school. "Well, Dad should be home in about half an hour, and then we'll find out what this mystery is all about," said Elizabeth. She dropped her books on the counter of the Wakefield's Spanish-tiled kitchen and then poured herself a glass of milk. "Did he give you any clue about what it is?" Jessica asked, her blue-green eyes sparkling. Elizabeth sighed and threw up her hands. This was the third time that Jessica had asked her the same question, but Elizabeth could never stay annoyed at her sister for long. Being twins made them as close as any two people could be. From their long blonde hair to the dimples in their left cheeks, they were exact doubles in appearance. "All I know is that at breakfast this morning, after you left, Dad said he would tell us the secret tonight," Elizabeth said. "By the way, where did you go so early this morning?" "I had booster practice," Jessica told her. The Boosters were a cheering and baton squad that Jessica belonged to at school. "I just can't wait to hear this secret." Elizabeth took her social studies book and sat down at the kitchen table. "Yes, I'm excited too," she said, opening the book. "But right now I'm going to try to get some of my homework out of the way." Her concentration was quickly broken by the sound of Jessica's fingernail tapping on the counter. Raising her head, she gave her sister a long, hard stare. "I'm trying to get some work done," she said. But Jessica ignored her comment. She was much less concerned with things like homework than her hard-working twin. She never understood how Elizabeth could come home after a long day at school and start in immediately on her homework. "Maybe Dad's going to tell us that he's taking us on a trip to Europe," Jessica declared. "Or maybe the secret is that we're finally getting a boat." She started to pace back and forth across the kitchen. "Maybe he's going to tell us that we have another twin, that we're really triplets," she said, her blue-green eyes growing wide. Elizabeth burst out laughing, remembering the time she and her sister pretended to have a triplet named Jennifer in order to pull a joke on their friend, Brooke Dennis. "I'm sure that would surprise Brooke," she exclaimed, giggling. "Jessica, instead of letting your imagination run wild, why don't you try doing some of your homework?" Jessica shook her head. "I'm too excited to sit still. I can't even think of doing homework right now." She continued to pace across the room, her blonde ponytail bouncing up and down with each step she took. As she looked up at her sister, Elizabeth noticed the barrette that she'd just purchased. It was in Jessica's hair. "Hey, isn't that my barrette?" Elizabeth asked. "Oh, this?" Jessica asked innocently, touching her hair with her fingers. Then, in her sweetest voice, she explained, "I noticed it sitting on your dresser for almost a week. I thought maybe you decided that you really didn't like it." "You could have asked," Elizabeth said. Though she was used to Jessica borrowing her things without asking, it still bothered her. "I promise I'll never borrow anything of yours again without asking first," Jessica assured her. "Here, you can have it back, big sister," she said, starting to remove the clip from her hair. Elizabeth smiled. It was a running joke between the twins that Elizabeth was the big sister because she had been born 4 minutes earlier than Jessica. "That's all right. You can keep it. Besides, it looks better on you," Elizabeth said. "How could it look better on me?" Jessica asked. "I mean, we look exactly the same." "I'm not sure," Elizabeth admitted, "but if you say another word, I just might ask you to return it." Jessica smiled and clamped her hand over her mouth. "Don't worry, my lips are sealed," she exclaimed. "I'll believe that when I see it," Elizabeth thought with a sigh. Elizabeth started to read once again, and Jessica went over to the refrigerator and opened the door. "Look at this!" she exclaimed. "What?" asked Elizabeth, closing her book. She wasn't going to get any work done with Jessica around. "Look at all this food," said Jessica, opening the door wide enough for Elizabeth to see. "I guess we beat Stephen home," Elizabeth observed. Stephen was the twins' older brother and a freshman at Sweet Valley High. Jessica and Elizabeth often joked that he could eat more than all of the Wakefields put together. "Wow, this is great," Jessica said as she removed a plate of brownies. "I'm glad we got here first." Jessica crammed a brownie into her mouth and was about to grab another one when Elizabeth warned her. "Don't spoil your appetite." Jessica said. "Dad's taking us out to eat because Mom's having dinner with a client," Elizabeth reminded her. "Don't worry, I never lose my appetite," Jessica joked, reaching for yet another brownie. "Lizzie, what do you think the secret's going to be?" Elizabeth shrugged. "Don't you even have a guess?" Jessica asked. Elizabeth had no idea about the secret, but just then another idea occurred to her. "Jess, why don't you and I make dinner for Dad? I think he'd really appreciate it. It'd be a real surprise, but we don't know how to cook," Jessica interrupted. "That's not true. I can make spaghetti and you make a great salad." Elizabeth could tell from the grimace on her sister's face that she wasn't exactly excited about the idea. "I want to go out," Jessica said firmly. "It'll be much more fun." Okay, it was only a suggestion," Elizabeth muttered. When the twins had entered the 6th grade, Elizabeth noticed that their interests were beginning to take separate paths. Elizabeth liked to read and write and have long talks with her close friends. She was in charge of the Sweet Valley Sixers, the 6th grade student newspaper at Sweet Valley Middle School. Jessica preferred cheering at basketball games and gossiping at meetings of the Unicorn Club, an exclusive all-girls club to which she belonged. She also loved to dance and took ballet lessons at Madame Andre's studio. But having different interests didn't stop them from being best friends. Though they'd grown in separate directions, Elizabeth felt there was no one in the world closer to her than Jessica, and she knew in her heart that Jessica felt the same way about her. At that moment, Elizabeth heard a loud noise and jumped up. At the same time, Jessica gasped, her eyes growing wide and fearful. "What was that?" Jessica stammered in fright. "I don't know," Elizabeth whispered, starting to tremble. Now she heard distinct footsteps coming up the basement steps. "Someone was in the house? Was it a burglar?" Elizabeth saw Jessica's tanned face instantly turn white as a sheet. She grabbed Jessica's arm tightly as the footsteps grew closer. Then, to their horror, someone opened the basement door. They froze. "What's going on? Are you two getting reacquainted?" Stephen Wakefield asked as he walked in and saw his sisters with their arms around each other. "Stephen," Elizabeth cried, "what are you doing here?" "I live here, remember?" Stephen replied. "You mean you were home the whole time?" Elizabeth asked, looking confused. "We didn't think you were here. The refrigerator was full," Jessica added. "You practically scared us to death." "I was downstairs doing my laundry," he reported matter-of-factly. Then he started dribbling an imaginary basketball. Aside from eating, basketball was Stephen's favorite activity. "You doing laundry?" Elizabeth asked in disbelief. "I didn't think you could even know the washer worked," Jessica commented sarcastically. "That's how much you know," Stephen said, making a noise between a chuckle and a snort. Elizabeth thought Stephen was the most immature 14-year-old she knew. "I still don't understand why you were doing laundry," she continued. "And I'd like to know why you didn't raid the refrigerator like you always do. Are you sick or something?" Jessica asked. "Ha ha, you guys think you're so smart. Since you're going out with Dad, I'm going out too. I'm going to the Dairy Burger with some of the guys, and I wanted to save my appetite so I'd have room for at least 2 cheeseburgers, 2 chocolate shakes, and—" "Stop," Jessica cried as she bent over and clutched her stomach. "I'm getting sick just listening to this." "That still doesn't explain the laundry," Elizabeth observed. "Can a guy wear clean clothes? Mom's so busy these days that I have to do this myself. We all have to learn to help out." It was true that their mother, who had a job as a part-time interior designer, had been working long hours lately. "Is this Stephen Wakefield talking?" Jessica asked. "Mr. Big Deal High School freshman? I remember when it was too much for you to carry a dish to the sink." Elizabeth was impressed. She had never heard her brother sound this mature and responsible. He claimed that high school was changing him. Maybe, she silently admitted, he was right. The old Stephen would never have given a moment's thought to helping out around the house. "Now I've got to throw my stuff in the dryer," Stephen announced, starting downstairs again. He turned around and added, "By the way, Mom said that you can wash sneakers in the machine, so I threw mine in with the rest of my clothes. Does that sound okay?" "Oh, no," Jessica exclaimed. Elizabeth shook her head. "You're supposed to wash them separately," she explained, starting to laugh. Things hadn't changed as much as she thought. The new Stephen was very similar to the old one. "Do you need any help?" "Thanks, but the day when I need help from a sixth grader is a long time away," he shouted, then dashed back down to the basement, 2 steps at a time. Just then, Elizabeth and Jessica heard the front door open. "I'm home," boomed a deep voice. Mr. Wakefield came into the kitchen, a big smile on his rugged, tanned face. With brown hair and eyes, he looked like an adult version of Stephen. "How are my favorite twins?" he asked. Jessica ran over and gave him a big hug. Just as Elizabeth was about to do the same, Mr. Wakefield noticed the whirring hum coming from the basement. He looked startled. "What's that?" he asked. "Stephen's doing his laundry," Jessica informed him. Mr. Wakefield looked surprised. "You're kidding. All of you are turning into such responsible—" "That's right, Dad. We really are," Jessica interrupted, in case he had changed his mind about telling them the secret. "And that's why tonight's the night. You girls have shown me that you're old enough to keep a secret. So, do you promise not to tell anyone?" "I promise," Elizabeth assured him, placing her right hand over her heart. "Me too," Jessica said. "Me too what?" her father asked. "I promise," Jessica declared. "Good. Then we have an understanding. I'll change my clothes and say hi to your brother, and then we'll go. How does Guido's sound?" Guido's Pizza Palace was an old family favorite, and it also had the world's best pizza. "That's a great idea," Elizabeth told her father. "To tell you the truth, I've had so much pizza lately it's coming out of my ears," Jessica whispered to her sister as they raced upstairs to get ready. "It serves you right for not bringing your lunch to school and having to eat those awful mini pizzas in the cafeteria," Elizabeth scolded. For once, Jessica had to agree. "You're right. Besides, it's not every day that a handsome man wants to take me out for dinner," she said with a giggle. Elizabeth opened the door and smiled as she glanced at her neat blue and cream bedroom and all her familiar belongings. It wasn't long ago that she and Jessica had shared a room and constantly got into arguments about keeping it clean and how to decorate it. But all that had changed once each twin had a room of her own. Elizabeth changed her sweater and brushed her long blonde hair vigorously. After applying a dab of clear lip gloss to her mouth, she was ready to go. She walked through the adjoining bathroom to Jessica's room. Jessica called out, "I'll be ready in a sec. Have a seat, Lizzie." That's easier said than done, Elizabeth thought, looking around her at Jessica's pink and white room. Piles of clothing were on every piece of furniture. She cleared a spot on Jessica's messy bed and sat down. Then she looked around the room and wondered how Jessica ever found anything in there. "Jess, may I have my clip back, please?" Elizabeth asked. She wanted to reclaim it before it got lost in the room's confusion. "That is, if you can find it," she joked. "No problem," said Jessica. She went straight to the pile of clothes on her desk, reached underneath, and to Elizabeth's amazement, found the clip immediately. Jessica might not be the tidiest person in the world, Elizabeth thought, but she knew exactly where everything was. After trying on several different outfits, Jessica still wasn't ready. "Guido's is very casual," Elizabeth reminded her. "It doesn't matter what you wear." Looking shocked, Jessica answered, "Of course it does. It matters to me. I always try to look my best." Before Elizabeth could respond, Jessica changed out of her sweater and into a light blue sundress. Then she tied a purple belt around her narrow waist. Jessica always made a point of wearing at least one purple article of clothing. She did this because she was a member of the Unicorn Club, and every girl in the club did the same. The unicorns were very exclusive and considered themselves to be as beautiful and special as the mythical animal of the same name. Elizabeth made no secret of the fact that she was proud not to be a unicorn. She thought that the club's sole purpose was to talk about clothes and boys and to gossip about girls who weren't unicorns. When Jessica was finally ready, the girls ran downstairs to meet their father. "Now, Dad?" Jessica asked excitedly. Mr. Wakefield chuckled and said, "I'll tell you one thing, this secret is older than you girls." Hearing this made Jessica even more impatient. "Come on, Dad, please tell us," she pleaded. "I'll die if I have to wait a second longer." "Don't do that. It'll ruin the secret," Mr. Wakefield joked. Then he grew serious. "Ithac I, the Ithac Inc., the Ithac is, wi Ithac Gil, se Ithac Gom, Ithac Gus, Ithac Gus, se Ithac Pry, Ithac Guys." "Huh?" Jessica asked, not understanding a word she just heard. "What did you say?" asked Elizabeth. It sounded like a mixture of Pig Latin and Greek. Their father continued, "This is a secret language called Ithac. I learned it when I was just about your age. I'm going to teach it to you, but I want it to be just between the three of us. It'll be our private way of communicating." In a million years, Elizabeth would never have guessed that this was the secret. Jessica looked a little disappointed, which was understandable since she'd been expecting something more like a trip to Europe. But as Mr. Wakefield continued to talk in Ithac, she seemed to grow more curious. Suddenly, Jessica was full of questions. "What does Ithac mean?" Jessica asked. "How long will it take for us to learn it?" "I promise you one thing," said Mr. Wakefield. "You'll be speaking it fluently by the time you go to bed tonight, and I'll tell you everything you need to know as soon as we get to Guido's." Chapter 2. When the waiter came over to their table, Mr. Wakefield ordered a large Guido's Deluxe. Then he began his story. "When I was a boy, I had a friend named Billy Fantana. Billy and his family lived across the street. We were practically inseparable, just like you two, especially when you were little. We had a secret treehouse in the woods, and we—" "Dad," Jessica interrupted, "what about Ithac?" "Don't worry, I'm getting there. First, I'm giving you a little background. Now then, where was I? So Billy and I—" Mr. Wakefield told them that Billy had learned about Ithac from his father. Mr. Wakefield and Billy spoke Ithac all the time, and nobody knew what they were saying. Elizabeth was fascinated. She tried to imagine her father as a little boy and listened closely to everything he said. But Jessica was definitely less interested. She rolled her eyes and played with her knife and fork, twirling them between her fingers like a baton. It was good practice for the boosters, she told herself. Then Mr. Wakefield looked at Jessica and said, "Je Ithages Ithaca ka, we Ithagants, Ithac two, le Ithac earn, the Ithac is, le Ithac ang, Ithac wage." Jessica looked up, thinking that she'd heard her name, but she wasn't quite sure. Elizabeth was just as confused as her twin. She concentrated on what her father was saying. Certain sounds were familiar, and Ithac was repeated over and over again. "It's really very simple," Mr. Wakefield said, switching back to ordinary English. "It doesn't sound it," said Jessica doubtfully. "Listen closely," their father instructed them. "This is how it goes. First, each syllable of a word has its own Ithac. That is, you simply insert an Ithac inside each syllable. For example, let's take the word twin. In Ithac, it would be twi-Ithagin." Elizabeth stared at her father, trying to follow what he was saying. "Now you try it. How would you say the word girl in Ithac?" After a few moments, Elizabeth answered, "I think it would be Ithac Earl." "Very good," exclaimed Mr. Wakefield. He continued, "But words of 2 letters or less, like I, it, and am, start with Ithac. Ithac I, Ithac it, Ithac am, and so on. Basically, that's the secret. Give it a try, Jess." "Yes, try," urged Elizabeth. "I mean, Ithac guess, try Ithac ye. Get Ithac good, wi Ithac gork, li Ithac is, Mr. Wakefield laughed and patted her on the back. The Ithac ainks to Ithac gad, Elizabeth replied. This was supposed to be between the three of us, Jessica protested. Elizabeth could already speak this new language, and she could barely understand it. It wasn't fair. Honey, you'll pick this up in no time, her father reassured her. Think of how much fun it's going to be, Elizabeth exclaimed. Everyone will go absolutely crazy. Think how upset Leela will be. Leela Fowler was a unicorn and a good friend of Jessica's. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Sweet Valley. Elizabeth thought she was a big snob and spoiled rotten. She really wasn't concerned with what Leela thought, but she knew that her sister cared a great deal. Jessica took a moment to concentrate, trying to remember the rules to Ithac. Just then she saw Caroline Pierce walk into the restaurant with her mother. Caroline wrote the gossip column for the Sweet Valley Sixers and was known as the biggest blabbermouth in school. She had very long red hair and always wore her shirts buttoned all the way up to the top. Jessica blurted out, Carol Ithacine, purse Ithac is, here Ithac. Mr. Wakefield smiled at her effort, even though it was a little mixed up. At first, everyone has a little trouble with Ithac, he commented. Then he asked Elizabeth if she knew the correct way to say Caroline Pierce is here in Ithac. After thinking it over for a moment, Elizabeth replied, Care Ithac o Ithac ein, pi Ithac ears, Ithac is, hi Ithac ear. Very good. Then he turned to Jessica and repeated the rules. You see, every syllable gets an Ithac. With short words, put the Ithac first. But Caroline really is here, Jessica insisted. Elizabeth looked over her shoulder. Sure enough, Caroline was standing there. Pretend you don't see her, Jessica whispered. I don't want her coming over here. She's always sticking her nose in where it doesn't belong. At that moment, Caroline spotted them, waved, and started walking toward their table. Ithac oh, Ithac no, cried Jessica. Shh, Elizabeth urged, putting her finger to her lips. When Caroline reached their table, she asked suspiciously, Did I hear something strange going on at this table? Jessica smiled sweetly. You heard us speaking a different language. Oh, really? Caroline said, her eyes widening in surprise. What is it? French? Spanish? I'm sorry, Caroline, but I can't say. It's a secret language. It's only between the three of us, Jessica told her. But Caroline wasn't about to let the subject drop. Why is it a secret? She persisted. This is sort of a family matter, Caroline, Mr. Wakefield said. You must have secrets in your family. None like this, Caroline retorted and walked toward the next table. Ithac I, Ithac am, per Ithac gowd, Ithac of, ye Ithac u, j Ithac guess, for Ithac gor, n Ithac got, to Ithac el, Ithac ing, Mr. Wakefield said to Jessica. Just then the waiter appeared, carrying a steaming pizza high above his shoulder. He placed it on the table and suggested they let it cool off for a few minutes before they started eating. But Jessica, who rarely paid attention to advice, immediately pulled a slice toward her and took a bite. Ouch, she cried. Jessica, why didn't you listen to the waiter? Elizabeth scolded. You have the patience of a flea. She quickly pushed a glass of water toward Jessica. Ithac I, Ithac am, Ithac ari, apologized Jessica, after downing the whole glass of water in 3 gulps. Pretty good, Jess, Mr. Wakefield commented. Just remember, each syllable has its own Ithac. If a word has more than 1 syllable, you continue in the same manner for each. Jessica corrected herself. Ithac I, Ithac am, Ithac ar, Ithac e. Mr. Wakefield smiled. Both of you are very quick learners. It took me days to get the hang of this. The Ithac angst, Ithac ad, said Elizabeth. Ithac we, li Ithac gov, the Ithac is, see, Ithac crick, Ithac it, Jessica declared. Ithac I, ni Ithac oo, I Ithac oo, wi Ithac ud, Mr. Wakefield said with a grin. Chapter 3. The next morning, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table eating a bowl full of cereal while Jessica painted purple stripes on each of her pink fingernails. Although Elizabeth thought the end result looked a little ridiculous, the process was fascinating. With deft fingers, Jessica applied each stroke. She dipped the brush in the polish, wiped off the excess on the side of the bottle, then made a single, careful line lengthwise down the nail. She repeated the exact same procedure for each fingernail. "You're a real artist when it comes to fingernail painting," Elizabeth told her sister. "The Ithac ain't ye Ithac oo. The Ithac ig, s Ithac is," Jessica said with a smile. She waved her hands back and forth and started to blow on her fingertips. Stephen sauntered into the kitchen with his books under his arm. He took one look at Jessica's outstretched hands and made a face. "Oh, boy," he exclaimed. "What happened? Did you get your finger slammed in the door?" "No one asked you, Stephen," Jessica snapped. "Too bad," he remarked. Mr. Wakefield came into the kitchen, briefcase in hand. "I'm in a hurry," he said. "Anybody need a ride?" "Sure," said Stephen. "What about you two?" Mr. Wakefield asked the twins. "Thanks, Dad, but I'd rather walk," said Elizabeth. Jessica nodded in agreement and said, "Ithac we, the Ithac both, wi Ithac aunt, Ithac two, wi Ithac gawk." Putting his fingers to his lips, Mr. Wakefield said, "Shh, remember, this is a secret." Stephen shook his head and looked confused. "This family's getting really weird," he said, following Mr. Wakefield out the door. As soon as they left, Jessica broke out laughing. "The best part about Ithac," she said, "is that Stephen doesn't know it." "Well, he will soon if he keeps hearing you speak it," Elizabeth warned. She got up and said, "Ready?" Jessica lightly touched her fingertip to see if it was dry. "Lizzie, would you do me a favor and carry my books?" she asked. "My nails are still damp, and I don't want them to smudge." Elizabeth had the feeling that once again Jessica was trying to con her. But before she could give her an answer, Mrs. Wakefield walked in yawning. She had on her favorite terry robe, and her pretty blue eyes looked as if they weren't quite awake yet. "Morning, Mom," Elizabeth said brightly. "Me Ithac gorn, Ithac ing, me Ithac said Jessica. Mrs. Wakefield looked surprised. "Is that the language your father was talking about?" she asked. "Ye Ithac es, Ithac it, Ithac is," Jessica declared with delight. "Oh my, Dad taught you that?" "Yes, but the thing is, Mom, it's sort of a secret just between Dad and us. You see, when Dad was our age, he had this friend," Elizabeth began. She didn't want to hurt her mother's feelings. "Honey, there's no need to explain. I understand completely. I think it's wonderful that you girls and your father have something private and special." "Thanks, Mom. You're terrific." Elizabeth turned to her sister and said, "Are your nails dry yet? I really don't want to carry your books. I have enough of my own." Jessica looked surprised. She wasn't used to being turned down by her sister. At this point, Mrs. Wakefield noticed Jessica's hands. "How interesting," she commented. "I don't believe I've ever seen anything quite like that." "Thanks, Mom. I came up with this design all by myself." "Are you girls hungry?" Mrs. Wakefield asked. "Can I fix you some breakfast?" "No, thanks. We're in a hurry," Jessica answered. She turned to Elizabeth. "Le Ithac gets, get Ithac get Ithac go, Ithac ing." Elizabeth followed her to the door, surprised to find that Jessica had agreed to carry her own books. "Bye, Mom. Have a good day." "Get Ithac good, but Ithac I, me Ithac Jessica sang out. Elizabeth and Jessica strolled down the tree-lined streets of Sweet Valley, California, a town which both twins thought was the most perfect place on earth. As always, the sun was shining in a blue sky that was dotted with only the tiniest puffs of clouds. "Ithac I, wi Ithac gond, Ithac gur, wi Ithac gat, Ithac every, Ithac gone, wi Ithac gil, the Ithac ink, wi Ithac gin, the Ithac gay, he Ithac ear, Ithac is," said Jessica. "Remember, Jess, this is supposed to be a secret," Elizabeth said. "I know that," Jessica said indignantly. "Well then, I don't think we should blab it all over school." "Lizzie, I have no intention of doing that. Ithac I, ke Ithac gan, ke Ithac eep, Ithac see, Ithac crit, Ithac git. Ithac as, wi' Ithac gal, Ithac as, any Ithac e gun, one. Elizabeth looked doubtful, and Jessica started to get angry. Ithac I, wi' Ithac ud, ni Ithac ev, Ithac gur, Ithac go, be Ithac ac, Ithac on, Ithac my, wi' Ithac erd, she declared loudly. Wi' Ithac at, Ithac do, ye Ithac oo. Just then a familiar-sounding voice called out their names. Elizabeth and Jessica stopped and turned around. It was Amy Sutton, one of Elizabeth's friends. "Wait up," she called, running toward them. "What's going on?" Amy asked when she caught up with the twins. Her pale blue eyes were bright and curious. "Not much," Elizabeth answered. "What's going on with you, Amy?" Amy was a smart girl, and she was also very direct. "I thought I just heard Jessica say something weird." "Oh, Jessica was just fooling around," Elizabeth told her, but she felt terrible about fibbing. Aside from Jessica, Amy was her best friend, and Elizabeth hated not being able to tell her about Ithac. Amy pressed on. "Are you sure? I could have sworn I heard—" "Well, you didn't," snapped Jessica, cutting her off. "You don't have to get nasty," Amy snapped back. Before Elizabeth could apologize for her sister's rudeness, Amy said, "I'll see you later, Elizabeth." Then she took off and ran down the block. Jessica turned to Elizabeth with a big smile on her face. "Aren't you proud of me? I didn't say a word about the secret." Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Proud of you? I'm furious with you," she cried. "How could you speak to Amy that way?" "What do you mean?" Jessica asked, looking confused. "First, you don't want me to speak Ithac in front of anyone. Then you get angry at me when I don't—" They were half a block away from school, and Elizabeth didn't want to start an argument. Already she could see groups of students milling around on the lawn in front of the sprawling brick building. "Let's just forget about Ithac for now," she suggested. "We can talk about this later." "Fine," Jessica agreed. As they approached the entrance to Sweet Valley Middle School, a group of Jessica's unicorn friends came over to the twins. Leela Fowler was at the head of the group, and she looked upset. "Hi, Leela," Jessica called out cheerfully, waving to her friend. But Leela just tossed her shoulder-length brown hair and flashed a cunning smile. "There's something we want to discuss with you," she said. "What's that?" Jessica asked. "Caroline told us that you two have a secret language," Leela said. Jessica giggled nervously. "That girl is always saying all sorts of things that aren't true," she said, trying to make light of the situation. "So she made this whole thing up?" Leela asked suspiciously. Jessica looked down at the ground. Then she glanced at Elizabeth, clearly looking for help. But Elizabeth just shrugged her shoulders. In a very small voice, Jessica answered, "No." "Ha! She was right. How could you tell Caroline about this first? This is a huge insult to the unicorns," Leela hissed, sounding angrier with each word she spoke. Her brown eyes looked as if they were on fire. "I didn't tell Caroline anything," Jessica cried in a desperate attempt to explain herself. "She just happened to overhear us speaking." "Speaking what?" Leela pressed on. "Yeah, speaking what?" Janet Howell chimed in. Janet was Leela's first cousin and the president of the Unicorn Club. "Tell us, Jessica," insisted Ellen Reitman, who could be just as demanding as Leela. All of the unicorns were pressing in on Jessica. It was a difficult position to be in, and she didn't know how to get out of it. If she told them about Ithac, she'd be breaking the promise she'd made to her father and Elizabeth. But how could she keep a secret from the entire Unicorn Club? Elizabeth spoke up, coming to her sister's defense. "It's a special language that our father taught us. He made us promise not to tell anyone," she explained simply. As she spoke, Elizabeth noticed Amy sitting on a nearby bench. It was clear from the look on her face that she'd heard everything. Elizabeth went over to her friend, but Amy immediately got up and started walking away. "Amy!" Elizabeth yelled, but Amy didn't turn around. Elizabeth ran after her and called her name again. Finally, Amy faced her. "Elizabeth, you lied to me," she said, her lips trembling. "I'm sorry, Amy. I didn't mean—" "You lied to me," Amy repeated. "I asked what you and Jessica were up to, and you said nothing. And then you had the nerve to admit everything to those dumb unicorns." Amy pushed her straight blonde hair out of her face. Elizabeth could see tears welling up in her eyes. Amy, I never meant to hurt you, Elizabeth said honestly. Let me explain. You see, my dad taught us a special language and made us promise to keep it a secret. You know what I mean? So last night at Guido's, Caroline overheard us speaking it, and now she's telling everyone. The only reason I said anything about it to the unicorns was because they were giving Jessica such a hard time. You know how awful they can be. Just then the bell rang. Elizabeth put her arm around her friend and said, We can talk more about this later, okay? Amy wiped her moist eyes with the edge of her sleeve. Okay, she said, with a tentative smile. Chapter 4. It was lunchtime, and Elizabeth was on her way to the cafeteria. Someone tapped her on the shoulder, and she wheeled around and saw Amy. I've been looking all over for you, Amy told her. I had to see Mr. Bowman and give him the master for next week's issue, Elizabeth said. Mr. Bowman was their English teacher and supervisor of the Sweet Valley Sixers. Do you want to eat lunch together? Asked Amy. Sure, Elizabeth replied enthusiastically. After what happened that morning, Elizabeth was pleased to see Amy acting like her old self again. As they walked down the hall, Elizabeth said to her friend, I'm sorry about what happened earlier. I never thought that a silly secret could cause so much trouble. It doesn't seem that Leela is ever going to forgive Jessica. Why is it silly? Amy asked. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment. It just is. If you knew the secret, I'm sure you'd agree. It all sounds so mysterious, Amy remarked. You and Jessica must be having a lot of fun with this language. Elizabeth thought it would be best to change the subject. We need more articles for the next Sixers. I was hoping you'd have some ideas. But Amy wasn't about to let the subject drop. Liz, since you don't want to tell me the secret, maybe you could just say something in the language. Elizabeth shook her head. It's not that I don't want to tell you. The point is, I gave my word that I wouldn't. How about if you write it down? Amy persisted. Then you really wouldn't be telling me, would you? Though she was half joking, Elizabeth knew that Amy was also half serious. Amy, can't we forget about this? Couldn't you at least tell me the name of the language? Elizabeth was growing annoyed. I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this, she said. It's not like you. Amy's mouth grew tight, and she appeared to be getting upset all over again. Her tone became angry as she looked Elizabeth in the eye and said, Why? I'll tell you why. We're supposed to be best friends, and best friends aren't supposed to have secrets from each other. Sometimes I think that you already have a best friend, and her name is Jessica. Elizabeth was speechless. She had no idea that Amy was the slightest bit jealous of Jessica. That's not true, she cried. Amy just stared at Elizabeth, a hurt look in her eyes. Elizabeth didn't know what to say. I guess I sort of have two best friends, she muttered finally. Oh, yeah? Well, from now on, you only have one. With that, Amy stomped away. Elizabeth stood in the hall in a state of shock, too stunned to follow the crowd of students heading for the cafeteria. She'd never known Amy to be so unreasonable. Hey, Elizabeth, are you coming to lunch? A friendly voice called out. Elizabeth turned around and saw Julie Porter and Mary Robinson waiting for her. Yes, in a minute. Why don't you go ahead and I'll meet you there, Elizabeth told them. At the moment, she was too upset even to think about eating. Maybe going outside for some fresh air would help. As she walked downstairs, she heard two girls arguing on the landing above her. Elizabeth couldn't see them, but their voices were loud and clear and very familiar. Jessica and Leela Fowler. If you don't tell me your secret, I'll never speak to you again for the rest of my life, Leela shouted. How can I? I promised my father and sister, Jessica pleaded. That's not my problem, Leela said nastily. She could be very unpleasant when things didn't go her way. Then Elizabeth heard a door slam and a whimpering sound, like someone crying. She ran up the stairs as fast as she could. Jessica was sitting on the steps with her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. Elizabeth put her arm around her sister's shoulders. Through her tears, Jessica said, How did this happen? I didn't do anything to hurt anyone. Elizabeth understood completely. She felt exactly the same way. Their closest friends had suddenly turned against them for no good reason. What are we going to do? Jessica asked after she had calmed down. Let's first go eat lunch, she suggested, hoping that perhaps some food would make them feel better. Jessica stood up and straightened her skirt. She ran her fingers through her hair and pulled up her socks. Then she pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed her damp eyes. "Lizzie, do I look okay?" she asked. "You look absolutely fine," Elizabeth said, putting on her brightest smile. Jessica broke into a wide grin and gave her a hug. They raced downstairs to the cafeteria. At the top of her lungs, Jessica yelled, "Ithac I'm, Ithac are, Ithac ing." Jessica hadn't brought her lunch to school, so Elizabeth waited with her on the cafeteria line. Then they walked out to the seating area. Carrying her tray, Jessica glanced at the table where the Unicorn Club always sat. She was surprised to see that Amy and Caroline, who weren't in the club, were sitting right at the center of the long table. Jessica felt a pang of sadness. The unicorns hadn't even saved a seat for her. Elizabeth was also surprised to see Amy with the unicorns. She was chatting and giggling as if she sat with the club every day. Elizabeth knew Amy didn't like spending much time in the company of the unicorns. What is Amy up to? She asked herself. Trying to ignore the unicorns, Jessica scanned the room, looking for a place to sit. The only free seats were at a table not far from the unicorns, with people she and her sister hardly knew. Having no alternative, they went over and sat down. Jessica ate her sandwich quickly and nervously, while Elizabeth just nibbled at hers. She overheard their names being mentioned at the unicorn table, but tried not to pay attention. Jessica, however, became enraged. She shot a dirty look across the room, but no one seemed to notice. They were too busy whispering among themselves. Then she got an idea. "I have the perfect way to get back at them," she told Elizabeth. Jessica pushed her wispy bangs out of her face and cleared her throat. "The Ithac is wi Ithac gil, me Ithac ake, the Ithac gem, ang Ithac gree," she said at the top of her voice. But the girls at the unicorn table still didn't pay any attention to her. Raising her voice even louder, Jessica continued, "Ne Ithac gal, ye Ithac oos, Ithac gay, Ithac Ithac ging, Ithac is." "Later," Elizabeth insisted. Jessica's scheme wasn't working. The people sitting nearby stared at her, but still no one at the unicorn table even bothered to look up. They just continued to whisper as if they hadn't heard a thing out of the ordinary. It made Jessica furious. She stood up and went directly over to the unicorn's table. As she approached, the whispering stopped. All the girls at the table turned their heads away and pointedly ignored her. Jessica had never felt more humiliated in her life. There was no way she was going to let the unicorns get away with it, she decided. "How long is this going to last?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Till you tell us the secret to your language," Leela said flatly. "I can't, Leela. Do you expect me to break the promise I made to my father and sister?" Leela just stared back at her. None of the other girls breathed a word. Apparently, that's exactly what they did expect. Chapter 5. Elizabeth was rummaging through her locker, getting ready to go home for the day, when Amy passed by. "Hey, Amy," she called. "Yes," Amy replied, a distinct chill in her voice. Trying to ease the tension between them, Elizabeth said, I was wondering, would you like to come over today? Jessica won't be there. She has a unicorn meeting. I thought maybe you and I could talk." "Sorry, I'm busy," Amy said curtly, going over to her locker. "Well, how about tomorrow?" Elizabeth persisted, following Amy as she walked away. "I have plans," Amy replied. "Amy, don't you think you're being a bit unreasonable?" Elizabeth said. But before Amy had a chance to reply, Leela Fowler came breezing around the corner, a mischievous grin on her face. She ran directly over to Amy and shrieked, "Have I got news for you? I just spoke to my father, and he's arranged for Chris Crosby to be the star at the benefit for the hospital. It's going to be at my house on Saturday, and Daddy told me to invite all of my friends. I hope you can make it, Amy." "Make it? Are you kidding? Chris Crosby is my favorite tennis player in the world. I absolutely adore him. You mean I'm actually going to see him in person?" Amy was practically screaming with delight. Leela glanced at Elizabeth but made no effort to include her in the conversation. Elizabeth went to her locker and pretended she was looking for something. She was suspicious about Leela's sudden interest in Amy. Everyone knew that they only talked to each other because of the boosters. I have so much to do, Leela was saying. I have to send the invitations, figure out what I'm going to wear. Do you want to help me, Amy? Sure, I'd love to, Amy replied. Great, Leela said. Then she lowered her voice and added, By the way, do you think I should invite Jessica and Elizabeth? I mean, since they won't tell us their secret. Elizabeth shut her locker with a loud bang and wheeled around just in time to see Leela link her arm through Amy's as they walked down the hall. Amy was talking, but Elizabeth couldn't hear what she was saying. She wondered if Amy was agreeing with Leela's spiteful plan. Elizabeth didn't mind missing a party. Missing the chance to see Chris Crosby didn't bother her either, but it broke her heart that she was losing her best friend, especially to someone as phony as Leela. When Elizabeth walked outside, she was surprised to see Jessica sitting alone on the steps. Hi, she said. I thought you had a unicorn meeting today. It was canceled, Jessica said with a frown. Besides, I'm not attending another meeting until they start acting nicer to me. I couldn't believe that scene at lunch. I know what you mean, Elizabeth replied. She sighed sympathetically. Amy won't even talk to me. As they walked across the lawn, Elizabeth didn't mention Leela's party, fearing the news might send Jessica into a rage. But just as they were leaving the school grounds, Amy and Leela strolled right across their path, talking loudly. Leela was saying, This is going to be the greatest party ever. The twins will turn absolutely green. When Jessica heard the word party, she stopped in her tracks. Leela, she called, what were you just saying? I'm sorry, Jessica, but I can't tell you. It's a secret, Leela answered haughtily as she and Amy faced the twins. Did you say something about a party? Asked Jessica. Oh, you mean the one I'm having this weekend? It's going to be very special, Leela bragged. Why is that? Jessica asked. Only because Chris Crosby is going to be there, and my dad's arranged for him to play a match in the afternoon. It'll be a big event, but I'm having my own private party. Chris Crosby? Jessica gasped, her mouth falling open. Leela continued, Yes, it's a benefit, and all the proceeds are going to the hospital. The adults have to make donations, but my friends can come for free. Of course, I'm only inviting my closest friends. Then she paused, grinned maliciously, and added, I guess that means you two won't be coming. Leela, how could you do this to me? Jessica demanded, outraged. Well, look what you two did to her, Amy declared. Elizabeth looked her friend directly in the eye. Amy, I didn't hurt your feelings on purpose, she said. If I could tell the secret, you'd be the first person I'd... Ha, Leela interrupted. Don't believe that for 1 minute, Amy. Now they'll get a taste of their own medicine and see how it feels. Come on, Amy, we have lots to do, she said, grabbing Amy's arm. Amy looked at Elizabeth but followed Leela. As they walked away, Leela looked over her shoulder and said to Jessica, If you tell me your secret, maybe I'll change my mind about inviting you to the party. Then she and Amy hurried off together. Can you believe this? Cried Jessica. What are we going to do? Elizabeth just shook her head. The twins walked home in silence. They didn't even feel like speaking Ithac. I think this has been the worst day of my life, Jessica declared. Don't worry, I'm sure this will blow over, Elizabeth said hopefully. In a week, no one will even remember that we had a secret. Maybe, Jessica said, not sounding convinced. But I'll just die if I can't go to that party. Everyone's going to be there. I wish we'd never even heard of Ithac. Later that afternoon, when Mr. Wakefield came home and walked into the kitchen, the first thing he said was, De Ithac id, ye Ithac ook, Ithac eep, Ithac si Ithac crit, Ithac it. Ye Ithac est, Ithac ad, Elizabeth answered with a groan. Ithac is, Ithacum, Ithacing, Ithacong, Mr. Wakefield asked, sounding concerned. We Ithacel, Jessica started to say, but Elizabeth immediately cut her off. Ithac no, she said flatly. She didn't want to spoil her father's good mood. Maybe she and Jessica could figure out a solution to their problem on their own.
"I've got a few calls to make," Mr. Wakefield announced. "Ithac week, Ithacant, Ithacock, Ithacate, Ithacer," he said as he left the room.
Stephen walked in, his books under his arm. He dropped them on the counter and went directly to the refrigerator. He grabbed as many things as he could hold in one arm, carried them over to the table, and started making a sandwich.
"Hey, did you hear about Leila's party?" he asked his sisters, spreading mayonnaise on a slice of bread.
"Yes," Jessica sighed.
"It sounds really great. I can't wait to go," he said.
"Since when are you going to a party of Leila's?" Jessica asked, surprised. Most of the time Stephen made fun of Leila.
"Since she started inviting famous tennis players, this is one party that I'm definitely not going to miss."
"So how did you manage to get yourself invited?" She prodded her brother.
"Leila just found me after school and invited me. I guess she wanted to have some older men there for decoration," he joked.
"I guess she wanted to rub it in some more," Jessica muttered under her breath.
"What did you say?" Stephen asked.
"Never mind," said Jessica. "It's just that Elizabeth and I aren't going."
Stephen looked surprised. "What's the matter? You always go to Leila's parties. Did you have a fight or something?" he asked.
"It's a long story," Jessica said wearily.
"Well, I think you should try and make up," Stephen advised, "because this is supposed to be the party of the year. They're having TV stars, photographers."
"TV stars? Who?" she asked, her lower lip trembling.
Leila said someone named Brett Carter is going to be there.
"Brett Carter? I adore Brett Carter," Jessica screamed. He was one of her favorite soap opera stars. "I can't miss this party. I just can't," Jessica cried. Then she turned and ran upstairs, bursting into tears.